So I'm going to use NX Create Workspace to create a new NX Workspace, and I'm going to do an integrated monorepo to hold our Angular application. We really wouldn't need to use NX for this, but I think it's a good option because I want to show how to do libraries, and I really like the way NX provides things like build caching. It also has generators, etc. So, we'll do it that way. So here in my terminal, we'll use npm execute create NX Workspace, and I'll make sure we're on the latest version here. It's going to ask us some questions. I'm going to use, as I mentioned, the integrated monorepo. It's what I'm most familiar with. A lot of times I go in and add things like a backend for front end using Express or something like that. And then I'm going to use the preset here for an Angular application. I'm going to call this repository. That's the directory it creates for your application, but it also becomes the root prefix for your Angular component. So to save me some typing, I'm going to give it a short little name, HT for hypertheory. What do you want to call the generated Angular application? This will be in our application folder, so I'll call that front end. I'll just use the default of CSS here because we're going to add Tailwind in a bit. So run Tailwind. This distributed build thing here is really nice. We still get cached builds, etc. if you're working locally, but if you're working with the team, this means you can hook up to NX's cloud platform, and with the affected tools within NX, it means that portions of your application, perhaps coworkers on your team have modified, etc., etc., it will only rebuild those if those need rebuilt. So I'm not going to use it because I'm not going to publish this or have a team work on it, but there we go. So I'm going to let it generate these dependencies. So while it is really handy because it gives you quick access to the likely things you would want to do within your application, however, you don't need to use that. You can run all the commands directly from the command prompt. I kind of go back and forth, to tell you the truth. I'm going to use the NX console within this demonstration because I want to show it to you, and also there's some nice tools, the graphs, etc., that I think are a little bit more accessible when you're using those NX build tools. So my application is finished here. It is created, and I'm going to take a look at what's in the directory. So it created a new directory called HT. If I go into that directory, it generated everything you might need to get started here, or at least most things you might need. You'll notice that there's a configuration for Prettier for code formatting. There's editor config. It has ESLint. The default options for ESLint are pretty strict in NX, as you'll see, but I kind of stay with them. I might have to work around them from time to time. It also has a .vs code folder with a list of recommended extensions. I'll probably add a couple things in there as we go along, but I'm going to go ahead and open this up in my code editor. I'll use Visual Studio Code. So in Visual Studio Code, you can see in our Explorer window here, that same directory. If you look in the VS Code folder, it has a list of extensions. So the Angular language service, that's the NX console I mentioned. There's Prettier. The default testing library, I'm not going to do any testing in this video, but for the lower level testing stuff is Jest. It also uses Cypress by default for integration or end-to-end tests within your application, and it installs the extension for ESLint. In the apps folder, you'll notice we have two different folders, where if you're using the Angular CLI, you might only have your source folder, but here we have an apps folder, and it actually has two different apps in there. One is front end. That will look familiar. That's like what we get with the Angular CLI. But it also has our end-to-end tests here, and this is the Cypress. You can leave that out. There's a flag you can run when you do npx generate or create workspace, but I just let it do it. Maybe we'll take a look at that later on. There is also a libs folder here, and the libs folder currently is empty, but we're going to, as part of this video, add a library. So the console is an extension that I already have installed here, this little NX console, and it just gives you a nice overview of your application. So you can see the console, it really just gives you quick access to be able to run commands, etc. And each of your projects, each of your applications will be listed at the top. Then it has common commands like to generate things, to serve things, to run your tests, etc., etc. What I'm going to do is click on front end here, and these are all the tasks specific to front end, and I'm going to run the build task. Now, you can actually drill into that and decide whether you want a production build or a development build. By default, if I just run the task here, it's going to do a developer build. So you can see in my console, in my terminal window at the bottom of the application, it compiled my application, has it running on localhost 4200. If I control click on that, move this over, we get our little welcome page here. And this is all coming from, if I go back to the source code here, in our source, this application we created, front end, and in the source folder, we have app, there's an app component TS. They also have this NX welcome component. If you look in app component HTML, that's just a reference to that component. So if I get rid of that and maybe use the title here and take a look at app component TS, maybe full, you can see I'm running Angular 15.04 within this application. So the next step is I'm going to delete all the generated components as well as the app module, and talk about how to create standalone components and then how to bootstrap our application with those components. So if you look in the indexed HTML, just as a reminder here, it's going to look for a component with the selector of ht_root. In our main TS here, it's using the app module and the platform browser dynamic, bootstrapping with a module, all that stuff. What I'm going to do is within this app folder, I'm going to delete everything that's in there. And you'll see for a moment we'll be doing error-driven development. It can't find that module. Perhaps I'll just get rid of that right now for a second. And then in app, while NX has generators, we can, generate a new component. So there's a generator for an Angular component here. One of the nice things about doing standalone components is you really you can just create a minimal thing to get going. So I'm going to do that in app here. I'm going to create a new file and we'll call this app component.ts. This first one, I'm just going to type this out, but then I'll create a snippet. That snippet will be available in this code repository linked in the description below. So export class app component, oops. And then we'll decorate this with the component decorator, and the selector, we know it has to be ht_root. The template, I'm going to use just an inline template here, maybe hello standalone. And to make it actually standalone, you use the standalone. And I need to put my little comma up here. So that's the new hotness there in Angular 14. It was released within Angular 14, but it's stable now in Angular 15. And what this means is this component can be used within your application without having it to be part of an Angular module. As you'll see, other components can import their own standalone components or other standalone components. So now that we have that, if I go back to main.ts here, there's a bootstrap application, and I just give it the name of the component. So app component. Import that, and that's all we need. That will start up our application. So if I switch over to my browser, there's my standalone component. In our next section, I'm going to add some routing and generate a few container components to show you how to add additional options to the Bootstrap application. That's where we can provide things like the router, etc. So we have an application bootstrapped. It started up. We have our component listed here. I'm going to use one of the generators, one of the recipes for NX to add Tailwind. I'm not going to do a bunch with styling. I'm not going to worry about things like responsive or accessibility at this point, but it's an opportunity to show you some of the cool little things that are available within NX. So when I add Tailwind, I think it's a good idea to shut down your ng serve, your serve command here, and then on NX there's a generate command, and this list at the top, so generate on the NX console, this list at the top has all the built-in schematics, tools for building recipes for adding different things to your application. What I'm going to do is just search for Tailwind. This one's particularly easy. Now you can run this from the command prompt, but it provides a nice little user interface. This one's really easy because all you have to do is give it the name of the application you want to generate Tailwind for. At the bottom, each one of these generators does a dry run, so it shows you what it's going to update, etc., etc. If you want to store that, maybe create a alias for it or something like that, this little button right here will copy that command to your clipboard. So if I close this and maybe just open up my own terminal, I could either hit run here, or down here if I paste that command in, that's exactly what it's going to run. So it updates, adds Tailwind. We get a new, if I look at my source code here, we get a new Tailwind config file for configuring our Tailwind setup. I'm going to add a couple little plugins for Tailwind here. So maybe npm install as developer dependencies, Tailwind CSS forms, Tailwind CSS typography, and I'll use Daisy UI. It's a little UI library for Tailwind that will make our web application. It'll give it that vital dark mode. So once I have those, I can require those here. There's forms, require typography, and I'll also Daisy UI. So now if I go back to my NX console and run the serve command again, look at my web page, do a little refresh action here. You can see we get the vital dark mode in the background. Not exactly attractive. Maybe we'll create a couple little components for this. So I'm going to create a masthead component for across the top, and then a navigation component, and then we'll add some routes in. Creating components, I showed you how to create our app component here. I like to use a snippet for these things. So this will be in my Git repository linked in the description here, but I'm going to create a new file. We'll call this TypeScript code-snippets. Paste this in here. So the prefix, the trigger for this will be NGSAC, which is a standalone component. It will use the workspace name. So for us, it's HT as the prefix for the selector. Then we can fill that in. It'll display a little message here. And then I did some regex magic here to convert the selector name, remove the spaces, convert it to uppercase or to camel case, all that kind of stuff. So now if I want to create some components, let's add a couple here. So in app components, maybe masthead component.ts, should be able to use my new snippet and masthead, and that looks pretty good. And then I'll do another one real quick. We'll call this navigation component.ts. Those both look good. So back on my app component now, instead of this hello standalone here, I'm going to have my masthead component displayed. So first thing will be the HT masthead component, and because this component, my app component, and the masthead component don't belong to a module, it can't find that. The Angular language service can't find that, the compiler can't find it, etc., etc. So the Angular language service has the ability, if you hit Control period on one of those, it will add it to the imports for this component. So now there's my masthead component, and if I look at the web browser, the masthead works. I'm going to maybe add a main section here, and inside of the main we'll do the same thing with our navigation component. There's our navigation component, and we're going to do routing here in a moment, so I'm going to add router outlet. Because I have let's see, yeah, it doesn't know where the router outlet is yet because I haven't used that yet in this application. I'm going to manually add that here. So router outlet, import that in from the Angular router. So now if I look at my component, you can see we have the masthead works and navigation works here. We'll create a couple routes, and then we'll style this a little bit so it looks a little better. We'll create a couple components. So maybe in app, new file, we'll call these containers, and we'll have a home component. That looks good. And what kind of application would we be if we didn't have an about component? Now both of these components, the home and the about component, aren't going to be selected, so I'm going to delete the selector for those. Those will be shown by routing. And then we're going to set up routing. Now there's no module. We're not going to set up a router module. We don't have a module to import our routes. So the convention is, and it's a fairly new convention, all this stuff is fairly new, is in the app folder you create a new file and call it approutes.ts. Yeah, so I already created this approutes.ts, import the Angular router, and you just export a constant that defines your routes. And I'm going to set up a couple here. So one will be for our home component, one will be for our about component, and then we'll do a catch-all here to redirect to home. So this one, path, home, component, the home component, and this one about, and the component here about component. That looks pretty good. And going back to our main.ts where this bootstrap application is, it takes an optional, not really optional, eventually you're going to need to have some things here, but a second argument that has a list of providers. And it's just an array of providers, and I'm going to do provide router. Provide router is going to take my app routes like that. So provide router is exported from the Angular router. It's a little functional provider, and you give it the list of routes. So now if I go back to my web application, you can see in my router outlet, home works, I was redirected here. If I go to about works here. And this, not get too carried away with it. I wouldn't be your guy to show that anyhow. But on the masthead component, I think we can do a little better than this. So maybe we'll do a header, and then in H1 Hyper Theory Labs, and maybe a tiny bit of styling on this. Make it full width, a little taller, a little gray, a little bit of padding, a little bit of margin at the bottom. This is all Tailwind. Make it extra bold. See how that looks. Beautiful. And then we'll go to our navigation component. And the navigation component, I'm going to use some things from Daisy UI here. We'll start with a nav element. And inside this nav element, create a div with a class of tabs. And I like the tabs ordered. So that's going to go here. And this will be for the feature we're going to create here in a second. Looks pretty good. I think that nav, and maybe I'll just do this to prove that if nothing else, I understand there's some controversy about Tailwind. It does make it so that even developers like me can center a div. So it looks a little better. Navigation thing here. So the home will take us to that home route. So I'm going to do a router link. Now, router link has to be imported as well. So imports router link. And we'll add that on about. I'll leave the last one alone for right now. Router link about. See how that's working. So home about changes the route, doesn't reload the web page, and then we can also add router link active. And I'll add that to both of these. Like that. So that gives us that nice little affordance. There's home, there's about, etc. Seems like I need a little bit of margin here. So on app component TS, maybe class PX12. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, it looks pretty good. So we've seen how to add routing to our application by adding an app routes, just exporting a constant, using the provide route function inside of our main.ts, how to import components and things like directives, like the router link directive, etc., within a component. What I want to do next is create a feature module, and an Angular module that we can link to from here. We're going to add a feature module to our Angular application. Part of this is to show you how you can do routing with that. And also, it's a nice little thing in NX. Now, with NX, you can create Angular feature modules. We're not going to need to do that. We're just going to create a module that just lets us write some TypeScript code. We don't want to use a module. So I'm just going to call this feature. It's not even a feature module. It's just going to expose some routes, and you'll see those exposed routes are the entry point for our application, and that's where we'll set up providers. Later on in the video, we'll do some things like perhaps add some Redux stuff in with NGRX so you can see how all that works together. So back in our application here, I'm going to use the NX tools this time to generate something, and I'm going to do a library. So as I said, there's a generator for an Angular library. Here I'm just going to do a JS library. It's a little misleading because you actually have to tell it that you want to use JS, otherwise it uses TypeScript, and of course we do want to use TypeScript. I'm going to give this library a name, maybe We'll give it the clever name of some feature, and then to be able to import that, these provide really nice boundaries for your code within your Angular application. So within our app module or any other components that would need this, we would need to import it. I'm going to set the import path to HT feature, and when I run this, you'll see at the bottom here, it created a new feature. And actually, if you look at the NX console here, it knows there's a new feature. We can build that. We can run the tests separately here. We're not going to get into that in this video, but that's one of the reasons I really like these feature modules. I mean, if you have enough tests, they're slow. You know, they're all running in TypeScript, etc. Each one of your features can have their own set of tests. When you're doing continuous integration and continuous deployment, you can tell it to just run the test for the stuff that was affected by the last commit, etc., etc. So it can really speed up your workflow and give you an all-around better developer experience. So in our source code here, that went into the libs folder. Now, when it created this, it creates a libs folder and index.ts. Let me do a little housekeeping here. The index.ts is in the root of the source folder, and this is everything that will be exported from this feature. Nothing else. Everything else is internal to this feature. In the feature itself, it didn't know what to do, and it even wrote a little spec for you, so I'm going to delete both of those things and get rid of the export here as well. And sticking with my way of working here, I'm going to use my little snippet. We'll call this feature component.ts, and I'm going to create a standalone component. So feature like that looks good. And then to set up the routes, very similar to what we did in our application in the app, I'm going to create a new file called feature.routes.ts and export const feature routes. It's going to be a set of routes. I'm going to bring that in from Angular, and for right now, I'm not going to set the path here. I'm going to let the app component decide what the path is, and the component will be the feature component. Now, to make this part of my application, I'm going to do lazy loading of this feature. I really like that for lots of reasons. One is it keeps your bundle sizes smaller. It also works really well in terms of caching. I'm going to do a video later on about caching and optimizing Angular applications for quick initial visits and things like that. But we're going to do some lazy loading. So I'm going to go back to my app routes, and here I'm going to decide that this is going to be called feature, and I'm going to use the load children, and instead of feature routes. Now, the reason I'm getting an error here is I didn't put in my index here that we're exporting that. Lib feature routes. So back on app routes here, I'm going to use a dynamic import. This was that little option I set for the import path within the NX generator for this feature, and then just load the routes itself. So now if I go back to maybe my navigation component, we can add a little link here, a little copy paste action. And then back on the browser, I click on feature, the feature works, home, about feature. If I go home, and I'm going to open up my developer tools here, and on the network tab, I'm at the home route, so everything's going to get loaded. I'm going to clear that out, and now when I go to feature, it just downloads the bundle for that specific feature, and it's tiny. So we have a lazy loaded route. In is just to kind of round this out a bit, a little bit of redux within that feature route. So we'll set up our root state within our application, and then we'll add some feature state within the feature. And the reason I'm going to do this is not to be a thorough introduction to Redux or anything like that, but it's a good library because it also exposes the little functions that allow us to provide this stuff without modules. Okay, so back at it. We're going to, in our feature module, implement a small component. We'll just do a counter component that uses NGRX actions, uses a reducer, all that stuff. I could have used the feature builder within NGRX, but I'll do a full feature for this just to show you all the little bells and whistles. Probably won't go as far to show effects, but those can be added in just as easily. Right now, at the time of the recording of this, effects still need an effects class, but there is a pull request that's pending on the NGRX library that will actually let us write our features as standalone functions as well, using inject, etc. And some of that stuff you're going to see here. So in our application, I think the first thing I'll do is install those dependencies. So npm install, we'll do NGRX store DevTools. And I think that should be all we need. There is a generator for NX that allows you to add this stuff in. In my opinion, it's a little too opinionated. It does a little too much stuff for me, and I don't find that too challenging to do on my own. So in source here, in app, I'm going to create a new file. This is kind of my standard format for doing this, index.ts. This is in the app module because I need to set up the root state for our app module. I'm going to export an interface called app state. And it's going to be an empty interface, and export a const called reducers, which I'll use the action reducer map helper here of app state, and it's going to be empty. Now, in this little demo, or at least for the time being, this app state isn't going to have any properties on it. We still need it to establish the root state of our application. The ESLint rules set up in NX, as I mentioned, are a little strict, so I'm going to tell it to disable that little warning. It's just an ESLint warning. It wouldn't affect our build. You can see our application builds just fine here. Now, to make that part of my application, where do we hook this up? We used to use store module for root, etc., etc. So in main TS, there's providers here. And we could use the store module here and import that in, but there is a provide store. So there's actually two, provide state and provide store. If you look at provide store, if you look at the help here, this is the global store provider. In other words, this will go into the root of our application. In our feature, we'll use provide state. So provide store. Now for the DevTools, I could do, just provide store DevTools like this. And we should be able to see in our Redux tab, we have an empty application state here. Angular, since I think 14 doesn't provide environments by default, so if we wanted to conditionally load this or whatever, there is a generator for that just from the Angular CLI. You can do the file substitutions and all that kind of stuff, but one of the little utilities we have is dev mode here. So we could say, is dev mode, we're going to provide the tools or don't otherwise. So if we're in developer mode, and that's what we're doing now at developer build, we're going to provide the dev tools. Otherwise, we'll just throw an empty array in there, and we should still have access to our dev tools. That looks pretty good. So now in our feature module, we're kind of done inside the app now. In our feature module here, this library feature module, I'm going to kind of create the state we need for this. So state index.ts, export const feature name. Feature sounds great. Export interface, feature state. Our reducers. And I'm getting that little ESLint warning here. I'm not even going to ignore it because we're going to add some things on here in a moment. In the routes for this now, because we don't have a main TS, but in the routes, what I'm going to do is on this, add a provider. So the providers provide store, so there's provide state that and store. Remember, store is what we use. Big note here, the global store. We're going to do provide state, and this takes the feature name and the reducers, like that. So now if I look at my dev tools, you can see we have a new branch in our global application state for our free feature. There's nothing in there. It's just pregnant with possibility. So we're going to do the hello world of Redux applications. I'm just going to create a little component in my library. So maybe components counter component.ts. Create a standalone component. I'm actually going to call this feature counter. And we'll rough it out without Redux real quickly. And in our template, oops. Okay, we'll leave that one. We'll make this one increment our count. So this will be increment. This one will be decrement. And then maybe a little span in here with the current. And I could do child routes in here, set up child routes within this feature. I think what I'll do is just in this feature component, show that component. Looks like my Angular language service isn't digging deeply enough in here. So let's see if that, there we go. Just restarted the Angular language service. So let's see how that looks in our application. So if I go to the feature, boy, that's some stunning UI. We're able to do that. Maybe I'll clean that up a little bit. So we can see what's going on here. That's a little better. Okay, let's reduxify this thing. First thing will be, we want this to be a selected observable from our store, and we'll create some actions that get dispatched when these two buttons get clicked. So in state here, maybe a new file. I'll call this counterreducer.ts. I use interfaces a lot in Redux and types just about everywhere else. I don't know why, there's no rationale for that, but what should it be when the application starts up? Maybe just so we can see it change, I'll put something ridiculous in there, and then I'm going to use the create reducer helper from NGRX, give it the initial state, and then back on index.ts here. We'll add that to our state. Now we should see that value here. So I'm going to create some memo-wise selectors. We know we're going to need a selector that returns the current count for the counter component. So create a feature selector. I don't need to export it. Create a little memo-wise selector. Using the create selector method here. And finally, GitHub Copilot to the rescue. So this selector will get us to the counter branch within our application. So we have a feature selector, it'll get us to the feature selector, then within counter, and then we get the count. So you kind of read backwards. To get to the current count here, you need to go to the feature branch, or I'm sorry, the counter branch, and then back to the feature. And I can use that within the component now. So in my counter component, we could do this a couple different ways. I'll probably do it both ways. One is I'm going to need a reference to the store to select on here. So this current is going to become an observable. Comment these out because once it's an observable, we can't mutate it. So we can and probably will inject the store into the constructor here, but you can also use the inject function. So store, and then select current count. So this inject function allows you to, it comes from Angular core, it allows you to inject dependencies in declaratively instead, sorry, programmatically instead of having them on the constructor. You can also, and we will, you can do that on the constructor, but the inject thing's kind of nice because if you ever do any like inheritance, you get that big mess with having to call the super with all the dependencies, etc., etc. This is just kind of nice and clean. So here, I'm going to need async as well, right? Because we're going to subscribe to that. It's an observable. And to import that, just import the async pipe. So you can see we're observing that value. Our state says 42 and the current value of our component says 42. Now, of course, these buttons aren't actually doing anything yet, but we're going to do that next. So maybe back on the counter reducer, I'll go back to our meaningful initial state, count is 0, and then I'm going to create some actions as well. So counter actions, I'll create a new file, counteractions.ts. I'm going to use the create action group helper. It takes two properties. One is the source, which is the unique name for this set, and then the events, which is just an object map. And there's no data associated with that. So maybe count decremented empty props. So now back on my counter component, I'm going to need access to that store. I could just cache that in a little field, do something like store equals inject store, and right, so we still get the value. I could also just put the store on the constructor of this component in the style that we usually use to do this, or if historically done it. That's boring though, so I'm going to leave it this way. So on increment this dot store dispatch counter commands count incremented. And count decremented. So those will dispatch now. I always like to go back to the web page and watch my Redux tools here to make sure when I click the plus button here, does it dispatch count incremented? There's that action. When I do this, does it do count decremented? It does. Notice it doesn't change the count. That's what our reducer needs to do. So go to our reducer, and I'm going to add on here, go on counter commands incremented. If you give me the state, I'll increment it. So when we increment, we increment. When we decrement, we decrement. And if I go to the browser, look at that. If I look at the Redux Dev Tools, you can see the difference in the state for each one of those. And then as a final hurrah, we can use the Redux Dev Tools to replay all of our actions. So a quick review. The only thing exported from our feature module here, or our feature, I gotta get out of using that word module. Our feature are these set of routes. Within the routes, I have my base path set up, exposing just a component, and it provides the state. That state, that set of reducers here, is here, and it aggregates together the reducers from my counter. We created some memoized selector functions here that we're using within that counter component to keep track of what the current count is right here. And then each of these buttons now just raise an event, just dispatch a command to say that the count was incremented or count was decremented. Those are defined using a create action group. So the counter component, if you notice the word counter component here, and then look at our dev tools, each one of those actions, if I look at the details, the counter component said the count was incremented. If I do decremented, the counter component says the count was decremented. So you can see the relationship between the source name here and the event names. When we actually use those in our code, just a little side note here about this create action group, they look like just methods. Using some TypeScript type wizardry, it takes those string keys for those and creates little methods we can call little camel-cased methods. But it makes your actions much more readable this way. So hopefully you saw some things here that will encourage you to start using standalone components, drop your dependency on modules, etc., etc. In later videos, we're going to create a little UI library, talk about how standalone components in particular are useful with those, and we'll add some testing stuff in as well. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please remember to hit subscribe down below. It will help other people see this video. And help my ego a bit. And thanks for watching.